Here on The Colour of Country Life Flow FM, we're speaking with Peter Malinauskas, the opposition leader in South Australia. Peter, thanks for joining us on Flow.
G'day, Rikki, and good afternoon to your listeners, or good morning to your listeners.
And how has your visit to the southeast gone? You've been down there quickly yesterday. What was the purpose of that trip and how did it go?
Well, look, throughout the entire time that I've been leader of the Labor Party, which is approaching 3.5 years, I've been very keen to visit our regional communities. But I've got a particular interest in the southeast because there is just so much opportunity there, not just for the local community, but for our whole state. It was a really worthwhile visit. I had the opportunity to be able to engage with a number of business leaders. We had a community forum and then had some important meetings regarding regional health services, but also took the opportunity to announce some important policy as well.
Yeah, can we just go back on that regional health services one? Your opposition group has said that you will redirect the funding the Marshall government intends to spend on a basketball stadium. What percentage of that will go to regional health services?
Yeah, so Stephen Marshall has announced his key election policies so far will be building a $662 million city basketball stadium. I've said that that's not the right priority, particularly when our health system is struggling so dramatically, and that's before we've even got COVID. So I've said every one of those dollars we're going to bring forward and spend on public health. And then of that $600 million, 100 of it we're going to spend specifically or quarantine specifically to country health. You can do a lot of good with $660 million and $100 million in the regions. And we're out there at the moment engaging with people about how that $100 million will be allocated, and we'll announce that before the election.
Yeah, just moving across from health into the border issues and COVID-19 in a moment, but you just mentioned the word quarantine. Rob Lucas got a press release out this morning saying that it's a white elephant, the Labor policy, to have a dedicated quarantine facility and that you need to drop it. Your reaction to that?
Look, it's a bit unfortunate to see Rob Lucas playing politics with COVID like this. Throughout the entirety of the pandemic, I've been providing bipartisan support to the Marshall Liberal government on the health response, and as part of that exercise, we've been offering up a number of constructive suggestions. And when other states around the country were building purpose-built quarantine facilities, it was unfortunate. I think South Australia missed that opportunity and we advocated accordingly. But obviously we're moving into a different phase of the pandemic now. And hopefully what we can see is we can get that vaccination rates far higher. The need for quarantine will diminish. But certainly a year ago, we know that hotels doing quarantine wasn't working and it was sending states into whole of state lockdowns, including here in South Australia, which cost local economies tens of millions, or if not hundreds of millions of dollars.
So just on the pandemic, you talk about bipartisan handling. So to be clear, your position is, by and large, you would have handled the pandemic the same way Stephen Marshall has?
Well, Stephen Marshall has delegated all of the decision-making to Grant Stevens and Nicola Spurrier, and I think those two individuals have done a really good job. I think something that your listeners might not be aware of, but the way it works is the Transition Committee meets and they provide recommendations to the Police Commissioner, and then he signs off on those. And the Premier doesn't even sit on the Transition Committee. All the decisions are made outside of the Premier's office. And then after the decision is made, they pick up the phone and tell the Premier what they've decided, and then the Premier announces it. I think it's a model that's so far, by and large, served the state well. And like I said, I haven't had an appetite to play politics with the pandemic. This has been a pretty substantial crisis, and as opposition leader, I wanted to play a constructive role, and that's why we put a number of suggestions out there throughout the pandemic, and thankfully the government's taken up a large number of them. Yeah,
and as we move towards talking about that cross-border commission, I know the opposition in the lower house supported some amendments moved by independents on the crossbench, even including limiting the extension of time for the emergency powers. So what's the Labor's position on the emergency powers? Should they expire next month?
Look, we're happy to contemplate any legislation the government puts forward in this regard. What we think is that in such an extraordinary, when you hand over so much power and authority, there needs to be due oversight of that. There needs to be scrutiny over the exercise of that authority. That is the Parliament's role, and that's why we've seen it appropriate to extend those powers, but do it in a way that's controlled and measured and subject to scrutiny. So that's been, by and large, the position the Parliament has adopted. Thus far, there doesn't appear to be any legislation coming before us, but as always, when the government has brought legislation to the Parliament, we've analysed it constructively, contemplated amendments, but always ultimately passed it.
Yep. Now, we broadcast across 3 states, and we've spoken with one of the local MPs across the border regularly, who notes that Victoria and New South Wales have a cross-border commissioner, but South Australia doesn't. She's a Nationals MP. She said that we should have one. Your policy is you agree?
I do agree. Yeah, I think that I think there was a need for a cross-border commissioner before the pandemic, and I think the pandemic has just highlighted the need even more. And there are a number of good examples about how the cross-border commissioner between Victoria and New South Wales has done good work that has aided those regions, those local economies, and those services in cross-border communities. We think there's an opportunity to replicate that model here in South Australia. So the South Australian cross-border commissioner will be established under a Labor government. They'll be placed in the southeast, and they'll be charged with a number of responsibilities, including liaising with the Victorian cross-border commissioner as well.
And is that a policy that sort of is a bit like your quarantine policy in terms of a facility, contingent on whether we have a pandemic rolling? I mean, would this be a permanent appointee whether there's a pandemic or not?
No, it's definitely a permanent appointee regardless of the pandemic. That's the way it operates in the state, and we see no reason for it to operate here. The cross-border commissioner can do a number of things. I mean, principally, we want them to be able to reduce the regulatory burden and the bureaucratic burden of inter-border services. We've seen examples of that occurring interstate, but they also have the ability to work on regional plans that cross the border. So, for instance, in New South Wales and Victoria, on those cross-border communities, they've seen a more regional-orientated approach towards promoting tourism in areas like the Riverina, for instance. We think similar opportunities exist here in South Australia, and they're worthy of pursuit.
Well, Peter, thank you for your input on that, and we look forward to hearing more from the opposition coming to the state election in March.
Well, thanks, Rikki. I mean, I think the key thing as we approach the election is we've got this amazing opportunity to think about what the future of our state and our country looks like post the COVID crisis. We don't want that opportunity wasted, and that's why we're firmly focused on developing a plan for the future.